Okay, everybody, it is 3:30, which of course means it is time for the snake feeding. And so just so everybody here knows, for our audience online, we do have a live audience here, so you'll probably hear a little bit of noise coming off the exhibit floor. You'll probably hear some people chit-chatting in the back. For our people who are here live, know that we are also live streaming this. So as I mentioned to these fine folks on the internet, anything you say is very possibly going to get picked up on the microphone. As we're moving the cart around here, just be aware that there is a camera on it. And so there's a video that's going to come out of this that's going to end up on our YouTube channel. So if you're trying to avoid being in a video or being heard in a video, you've been forewarned. That being said, welcome everybody. We do these snake feedings every other Saturday. So this is the first time any of these snakes have been offered food in 2 weeks. We are going to be feeding all 5 of our snakes that we have here at the Headwaters Science Center. And one thing I'll note is that for a lot of these snakes, every 2 weeks is actually more food than a lot of them need. We just offer every 2 weeks because it's easier for our scheduling, frankly. But when you're talking about things like ball pythons and even the boas, honestly, it's more food than they need. So if one or more of these snakes decide to skip this feeding, it's not a big deal. We honestly fully expect some of them to skip sometimes. The first one that we're going to be feeding today is going to be Rusty, who is a common boa, or red-tailed boa, Colombian boa. You hear him called a lot of the time, and he's in the tank behind me here. Rusty is one that tends to eat pretty much every time, and Tristan here is actually going to be the one doing the feeding. And what our snakes are going to be getting are going to be rats or mice, depending on how big the snake is, basically. So bigger snakes get a bigger piece of food, smaller snakes get a smaller piece of food. Pretty simple. So what I have in my casserole dish here is a bunch, well, 5 dead rats and mice. So if you don't want to see a dead rat or see a dead mouse, you have been warned. And so Rusty is our second biggest snake, so he's actually going to be getting our second biggest piece of food here, which is going to be this rat there. I usually grab right at the base of the tail. Yep. And so the bigger ones can be a little tricky to get a good grip on. And so you'll notice one of the things that we have in our tanks here, and this is going to be true for all of them, is that there are newspapers at the bottom. And those newspapers you can almost think of as kind of a placemat for the snakes. So you'll notice that the substrate that the snakes have, at least most of the snakes have in there, are these wood chips. And these rats we buy dead and we keep frozen in a freezer in the back. And so the way that I thaw these out is I just put them in a bucket of water in the morning and let them thaw out over the course of the day before now. So they come out wet, and we don't want those wood chips that are in the tank to be sticking to the rats as they're swallowing it. So we give them the newspapers as kind of a placemat for them to avoid swallowing too much of that stuff. A little bit every once in a while is not a big deal, but we don't want them swallowing that type of stuff consistently. And you'll see Rusty is, here, maybe I can kind of checking out the side of the tank there. Rusty generally is a snake that is very eager to eat. He has hardly skipped a meal the entire time we've had him, to be honest. So I'd be very surprised if he fully skips here. But like I said, sometimes it can be a little bit of the challenge can be kind of teasing him over onto the newspaper to actually get him to strike it where we want him to strike it. So that's what Tristan's doing over here. Is he could, in all likelihood, just kind of tap Rusty in the nose right now with that rat and he would snag it. There you go. And so what you'll see him doing is he is going to now grab onto that rat and he's going to do constricting. So basically any snake that is not venomous needs to rely on constriction as its means of killing its prey. And so that's going to be true for all of the snakes that we have here, is you'll probably see them doing a little bit of the constriction there. And so what they're doing when they're doing that is that's how, like I said, a snake would kill its prey in the wild, is basically they'd wrap their body around it and squeeze it until it died. And actually what they're doing when they do that is actually will squeeze it so hard that they actually stop the blood from flowing. So a lot of people assume it's like an asphyxiation thing, that they're like strangling it. It's actually much faster and much more effective than that. You're dead before you have a chance to suffocate. And you'll see him kind of sit there and hold on to it. The last thing I do, like right before I come out with this, is I throw these rats in the microwave for about a minute, just to warm them up a little bit, give them a little above room temperature. And so when they strike at it, you'll see him grab it and hold it. And with Rusty in particular, he likes to hold on to his kind of for a few minutes before he starts working it down. And when you actually do see him start swallowing it, you'll see he's going to swallow it in one big piece. That's true for all the snakes we have here. It's a near universal in the snake world that they swallow their food whole rather than chewing it. And so you'll see that for all of ours here, is that they'll swallow them whole, and they'll generally try and do it head first just because that's the easiest angle from which to do it. So we'll come back around to Rusty maybe at the end, and he'll probably be finishing up. And so we're gonna have to be swinging the cart around here, folks. So keep an eye on cords, keep an eye on the cart. And where we're gonna go now is to the hognose snake, Sally. And so Sally is our smallest snake. We'll take our sign off here. And so even though Sally is a much smaller snake than Rusty, you're going to see them doing very similar type of thing with their food. Like I said, it's operating on a much smaller scale. So hognose snakes are unique among our collection in that they're like the one species of snake that we have at the Science Center that is actually native to Minnesota. Supposedly Bemidji is like in their range. Supposedly you can find them right around Bemidji. I've never seen one, but I know they're quite a bit more common down in like the southwestern part of the state and in South Dakota. And Sally is a little bit older snake, and one of the things that Sally has been struggling with lately is some vision issues, where Sally is actually developing cataracts in both of his eyes. And so you might have noticed he was having a little bit of trouble getting a hold of that mouse there. And Sally is a little different. Remember when I mentioned that it's a near universal that snakes swallow their food whole in the snake world? He is the one that is kind of a little weird about that. He does still typically swallow it whole, but he is unique among snakes in that he's the only snake, hognose snakes in general, there's 3 different species of hognose snakes. But hognose snakes are kind of unique in that they're, as far as I know, the only ones that actually chew their food a little bit before they swallow it. They have kind of a special tooth in the back of their mouth that they use to crunch up their food a little bit. Do you have a question, bud?
Yeah. Are you going to be feeding him?
No, we are only feeding snakes today. And so what you're looking at there is a bearded dragon, which is a kind of lizard. And so he eats 3 times a week, but today is not one of them. A couple other interesting things with the hognose snake. Call him hognose snake, so if you want to take a little bit closer look at him, what you'll see is he has a little upturned kind of scale at the end of his nose. And they'll use that mostly for kind of rooting around in the forest floor. They're kind of little digging, burrowing snakes. Because in the wild, they typically don't eat things like mice because they're too small for it. They tend to eat things like slugs and frogs and things like that. So being able to root around in the leaf litter a little bit is actually really beneficial for them as far as actually finding food. The other thing they're very notable for, and the thing that a lot of people are familiar with about them, if you see hognose snake stuff online, is they have a really interesting behavior that they do when they're feeling threatened, where they'll roll over onto their back and play dead. And they're oftentimes very theatrical about it. They'll like stick their tongues out, and if you flip them back over when they're doing that, they'll flip right back over again and continue playing dead, which is a defense mechanism for them. A lot of animals out there won't eat food that they find that's already dead. They want to kill it and eat it themselves, and that's how they know that it's fresh and not going to make them sick. So if you pretend you're already dead, and you'll see she even has kind of a pattern on, he already actually has kind of a pattern on his belly that's meant to look kind of gross and rotten and inedible for the sake of, like I said, deterring predators from eating them. Come around the corner here to the corn snake. This is Sophie. And Sophie is like I said, a corn snake. And Sophie is our youngest snake that we have here. Sophie is about 5 years old. Corn snakes can live to be 20 or so is about the most you can realistically hope for. The corn snake we had before Sophie passed away at 19. Like I said, Sophie is I think 5 right now. She was 2 when we got her. We've had her for about 3 years now. So a relatively young snake, but is about as big as she's going to get. Snakes never fully stop growing, but they do grow continually throughout their lives. So she might put on a little more length yet, but she's not going to get a whole lot bigger than she is. And that size that she is one of the things that makes them very popular as pet snakes. Corn snakes are probably the most popular pet snake out there because they stay pretty limited in size, and they come in a million different colors too. And you'll see she's doing, like I said, basically the exact same thing Rusty did, where she grabbed it, she's got it by the head, and she started wrapping her body around it to constrict it. As I said, when people hear about constrictors, and they tend to think of like these big, heavy-bodied snakes, think about snakes that are eating, big, large mammals, but like I said, any snake that's not venomous pretty much has to be a constrictor. Those are really the only 2 options you got when you're a snake. So a small non-venomous snake is just as much of a constrictor as a boa is. Other kind of interesting thing with Sophie, I mentioned that corn snakes come in a lot of different colors and patterns. That's because in the wild they have a very big range. You can find them in North America, basically anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains, like below a certain latitude. They don't quite make it this far north, but they do have them in Iowa. And then, like I said, you have them in the Rocky, like basically east of the Rocky Mountains all the way to the East Coast. And so one of the things that they found is that when you have a big range like that, your color pattern and your color and your pattern change a lot from region to region because your camouflage needs are different from place to place. So what you can do is you can take a corn snake from Pennsylvania and a corn snake from Texas and crossbreed them and get a whole new pattern, a whole new color that you would never see in the wild. So there's something, it's like 120 or something like that, officially recognized corn snake morphs out there, which again is one of the reasons they're so popular as pets, is because you can kind of very much like design your own with selective breeding. And so she's an example of one that is a pattern, or more specifically a color scheme you would never see out in the wild. She's what's called an amelanistic snake. So a color palette that is not helping her camouflage really anywhere. She's very much a domestic snake here. I'm gonna move over to Jeannie, the newspaper. One second. And so, one of the things that is true of these snakes is once we're done doing the feedings here, even if some of them don't take the food, we're still not going to be taking these snakes out for the rest of the day because they tend to be a little bit more, I don't want to say aggressive, but a little bit more unpredictable when the scent of food is around. So one of the things that we do, another kind of side benefit of the newspapers, is it's like a signal to them that it is feeding time. So we take everything else out of their tanks, we replace it with the newspapers, and the snakes know that when everything else leaves and the newspapers go in, like, hey, something's different, and every time this happens, that means it's feeding time, so that they're less likely to strike kind of at me when I'm reaching in there to take them out with guests. And I'm leading with this because what I'm about to do is something I wouldn't do really with probably any of the other snakes here, is I'm gonna, with my stinky rat-covered hands, actually pick this snake up and put her on her newspapers. And I don't do that generally because, like, if I tried that with Rusty, he would bite me in the arm. This snake is one that very rarely actually strikes at her food. I mentioned that a lot of these snakes, every 2 weeks is actually a lot more food than what they actually need. And for ball pythons, that's the most true of anybody we have here. I've worked with other ball pythons, and most people don't even offer them food more than once a month. The last one I worked with before I was here, Bob at the Great Lakes Aquarium, gets offered food once every 3 months. And so, like I said, our every 2 weeks is a lot more than what she needs, and as a result, we expect her to skip meals regularly. And she does. She maybe eats 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 times we offer her food. And so what I'll do is I'll tap her on the nose with it, just let her know it's there. Then I'm just going to set it on the newspapers. And more often than not, when she does eat, she takes it overnight. That's normal for ball pythons. They're naturally a nocturnal snake. They are naturally more active at night. But she actually didn't eat last feeding, but she ate the feeding before that. So she might take it, she might not. Like I said, I wouldn't be surprised either direction. I wouldn't be worried either direction. Ball pythons are well documented, going like a year plus without eating and being fine. So, like I said, if she misses for 4 weeks, whatever, no problem. And that's really, ball pythons are kind of exceptional in that regard, but it is something that's very normal for snakes to be able to go much longer amounts of time without eating. And the way basically they manage that is by really, really reducing their energy needs. And so doing things like sitting around and not moving for like days at a time. Don't bang on the tanks, bud. Really conserves energy. So if you're conserving your energy, you don't need as many calories. Having a really small brain, a really not very active brain, goes a long ways for that too. Being cold-blooded goes a long way for that too. You think about like when we're consuming calories, the things that are consuming them are things like maintaining our body temperature. We're just a furnace that you got to be dumping fuel in all the time. Our brain is the other thing that consumes a ton of calories. So go cold-blooded, reduce the brain activity, reduce the movement. All of a sudden you go from, we need to eat every few weeks or else we die. Like, ideally more than that, but we can survive up to like a few weeks without dying or without food. But like I said, a ball python can go, I've heard up to like 2 years. I said well documented like a year plus, but I've heard up to about 2 years. So like I said, 6 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever. Not a problem for her. Our last one we're going to be offering food to is our largest snake. So this is Artemis. And Artemis is another common boa, so this snake is the same species as the first one that we fed, Rusty. But you'll notice she's quite a bit bigger than Rusty is. And I will say this snake is about the same age as Rusty. I think she's actually a year younger, if I remember right. I think she's 15 and Rusty's 16, if I got my years right on that. They're actually pretty close to the same length even. They're both in the vicinity of 8 feet long or so. She's a little bit longer, but not a ton longer. But she outweighs Rusty about 3 to 1. Rusty is about 12 or so pounds, where she's floating somewhere around 35 right now. And that's very normal for not just boas, but for kind of snakes and even just like cold-blooded stuff in general. There's very much a tendency with most animals for the females to get a lot bigger than the males do. For mammals, we're kind of the exception. With mammals, the males tend to get bigger. For females, or for anything cold-blooded and really anything that lays eggs, the females tend to get bigger because the bigger female can carry more eggs, so they make more babies. And she's another one who oftentimes will not strike at the food right away when I put it in there. She tends to take it once it gets a little slower around here. The activity seems to be a little bit of a disturbance for her as far as wanting to eat a lot of the time. So one of those things where sometimes she strikes at it. She struck at it last week, or last feeding 2 weeks ago. But it's, as I said, it's not uncommon for her to not strike and then take it overnight or even just later in the day after the feeding. And so she is our biggest snake, so she is, of course, getting our biggest rat. And these are big enough and heavy enough that sometimes they're a little bit of a challenge for me to hold on to with the tongs. She also has kind of a tricky tank to feed into, too, so... For those of you hoping to see me get bit, this is probably your best shot. Hasn't happened yet. And so her head is in kind of a weird spot. It's kind of tucked around behind her body. I'm going to have to reach in there pretty deep. Actually, I'm going to go to the other door. I don't really know exactly where her head is back here. So touch her with it. Alright, so I think what we'll do is this is going to be another one where I just kind of leave it in there for her to take at her own pace whenever she wants to. This little jostling here. There you are. You're like... So she's kind of backing away from it. She's not a huge fan. And one of the things that is a little bit kind of a peril of doing the thawing the way we do is a lot of times snakes don't like having water like sprayed or dripped on them. So if the rats are a little drippy and it kind of catches them in the face when you're getting it in there, a lot of times that'll deter feeding too for a little while. So one of the things I could probably do to get a few more strikes out of them is make sure they're good and dry before I put them in there. In fact, if you ever go to like a bigger zoo that has bigger snakes, look at that exhibit and there's pretty much always a hose around there because one of the ways you get them to let go of you when they decide to bite you is you spray them in the face with a hose and then let right go. And so, like I said, not uncommon for her to skip, not uncommon for her to miss a feeding. She did just shed maybe a week and a half ago, and shedding is another one of those things that can sometimes disrupt the feeding cycle for them too, where a lot of times they'll skip a meal on either side of a shed. So she did just shed. This is a new skin that's up on top of her tank here. But otherwise, do we want to loop over to Rusty and see how he's doing? Has he got his down yet, or is he still working on it? He's got it down. Like I said, none of these snakes are going to come out for the rest of the day because they, one, the scent of food and, like I said, the kind of unpredictability of it. The other thing about them is the ones that do eat, they, a lot of times if you handle them too soon or too vigorously when they have food in their stomach, they'll vomit. And vomiting is a much more stressful process for a snake than it is for us, so we don't want to have to deal with that. Got a question, bud?
His head.
Yep. So she's poking her head up back there. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for watching online. And get our couple shout outs out here. Thanks to the Beltrami Electric Co-op for underwriting these shows with their Roundup program. So members of the Beltrami Electric Co-op can opt to round their bill up to the nearest dollar, and then they use that money to fund various programs around northwestern Minnesota, and we're a beneficiary of that, so thanks to them. Also thanks to Harmony Grocery Co-op in downtown Bemidji, Minnesota. They provide us with a lot of food that we give to our animals, so big thanks to them. Also, our open hours. We're open Monday through Saturday, 9:30 to 5, so come and visit anytime between that. Oh, and also Sundays from 1 to 5. If you come around 3:30, we'll probably be doing one of these shows, and you come on the right day with the right educator, and you might get a chance to participate and appear in one of these videos yourself if you're interested in that. Otherwise, yes, thank you all for watching, and